Have you ever asked yourself whether anything can truly endure forever? If everything that rises eventually comes crashing down, could capitalism be destined for the same fate? And what if it's not toppled by external forces, but is instead quietly orchestrating its own downfall? Karl Marx predicted that capitalism would ultimately collapse under its own weight, its drive for endless expansion making it fundamentally unsustainable. Meanwhile, Friedrich Nietzsche might contend that capitalism mirrors our deepest human instincts, our desire for power manifesting as money and consumer goods. But what occurs when this force grows so immense that it escapes all control? In today's world, capitalism is no longer just an economic framework. It has become the very filter through which we interpret existence. Mark Fisher once remarked, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." This statement is more than clever phrasing. It captures what Fisher called capitalist realism, the pervasive belief that no genuine alternative to our current system exists. But what if that belief is misguided? What if capitalism is actually a self-accelerating engine, hurtling toward its own demise? That's exactly what accelerationists argue, that the rapid pace of technological and market-driven development is pushing us toward an unavoidable collapse, or perhaps into a future beyond comprehension. So what happens when a system built on the promise of limitless growth begins to collide with real-world limits? Will capitalism vanish entirely, or will it simply morph into something so alien that we no longer recognize it? These are the questions we need to explore, questions that may help us determine whether we're on the cusp of a new era or staring into the abyss of the familiar world's end. Capitalism presents itself as an unshakable force, a structure that bends but never breaks, thriving through every crisis and coming back stronger. From the outset, it has survived war, depression, and financial catastrophe, events that should have spelled its end. Instead, it has adapted, changing form, absorbing the damage, and evolving. But does this mean it's truly invincible? Or is its adaptability just a way of stalling the inevitable, a system clinging to life by artificial means? Fisher believed that capitalist realism traps us in a collective illusion, the belief that the market-driven status quo is the only possible reality. With every new breakthrough in technology, with every turn of the economic wheel, we are led to believe escape is impossible. Jean Baudrillard took this one step further. He suggested that capitalism hasn't just shaped reality, it has replaced it. We now live in a simulation, a hollow version of freedom, where even our thoughts and emotions are turned into marketable products. But things weren't always this way. There was a time when alternative systems, both political and economic, were not just imaginable, but expected. Take feudalism, for instance. It reigned over Europe for centuries, and for the average medieval peasant, the notion of a world without lords and vassals would have seemed absurd. For a medieval peasant, the idea of a world without lords and serfs was unimaginable. Yet a sequence of social and technological changes was enough to bring that system crashing down. Similarly, empires of the past, once thought eternal, eventually collapsed under the burden of their own foundations. The Roman Empire, long considered invincible, fell not only because of barbarian invasions, but also because its economic and political framework became unsustainable. What if capitalism is on a comparable path? Once a powerful engine of progress, it now resembles a runaway vehicle, careening without direction. Marx foresaw capitalism's downfall resulting from its internal contradictions. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, unchecked exploitation, and the commodification of all things. But perhaps it doesn't need to be toppled by a revolution. Maybe it is in the process of self-destruction. Technology plays a key role in this shift. For centuries, capitalism relied heavily on human labor to fuel its growth. However, we are rapidly approaching an era where automation and artificial intelligence will render much of the workforce obsolete. What will happen when capitalists no longer require consumers, since production can happen without human input? Capitalism has always depended on the concept of scarcity, that something must be limited in order to hold value. But technology is now challenging this very fundamental principle. In Roger Zelazny's novel Lord of Light, settlers on a distant planet assume the roles of gods, controlling access to technology to preserve inequality. Eventually, a rebellion arises, attempting to liberate the people from the illusion they have been living under. This raises a disturbing question. Are we experiencing something similar today? Is it possible that the financial and technological elites are shaping the narrative to maintain their dominance, even as the system barrels toward inevitable collapse? If capitalism fades away, what comes after? Can we even envision a world without it? Or like the feudal lords before us, are we so entrenched in this reality that imagining its end is beyond our grasp? Maybe the key lies in acceleration, not in opposing capitalism, but in driving it to its absolute limit. If it truly cannot be broken, it should be able to endure any pace. But what if, at some stage, that acceleration becomes unsustainable? What happens when a system built for infinite growth encounters a boundary it cannot surpass? Capitalism has always operated as a growth engine. Since its inception, every technological breakthrough has only strengthened it, making it more efficient, broader in reach, and faster. Yet what if that very speed, rather than securing its survival, is actually what will trigger its downfall? There's a fundamental law in physics. The faster an object moves, the greater the force required to control it. Capitalism is accelerating beyond control, and that could pose a challenge even its greatest beneficiaries cannot solve. Nick Land, a philosopher associated with accelerationism, perceived this clearly. He viewed capitalism not merely as an economic framework, but as a near-autonomous organism, growing wildly, propelled by technological and market forces. Land argued that the future no longer belongs to humans. It belongs to artificial intelligence, digitized capital, and forces that no longer need humanity to function. As artificial intelligence doesn't require a passport, he wrote, neither does capital. What does this imply? That capitalism might be slipping from the grip of its creators. Consider the rapid pace of technological progress. The first programmable computer emerged in the 1940s. Today, microchips contain billions of transistors, and AI is already surpassing human abilities in various fields. Never before in human history has change unfolded so quickly. What once took centuries now happens over decades, or even years. And capitalism, fueled by its imperative for endless growth, only intensifies this acceleration. Accelerationism rests on a troubling assumption. If capitalism's collapse is inevitable, the optimal approach is not resistance, but pushing its logic to the brink. Marx hinted at a similar idea when he pointed out that capitalism generates its own contradictions. But accelerationism takes this further. Rather than waiting for the system to break down naturally, why not hasten its rush toward the end? This may sound like a doomsday scenario, but in many respects it is already unfolding. Technological advancement not only accelerates production and consumption, it also widens the gap of inequality. Where capitalism once depended on human labor to create wealth, Automation is now rendering much of the workforce obsolete. Economic crises that used to follow predictable cycles now appear increasingly frequent and erratic. The concentration of wealth has soared to unprecedented heights. While billions struggle to survive, a small elite amasses fortunes exceeding the GDP of entire countries. Such extreme disparity might indicate that the system is nearing its breaking point. When an organism becomes too large, it collapses under the strain of its own mass. Empires of old fell because their growth outpaced their sustainability. Could capitalism be heading down the same road? What's most alarming is that there seems to be no master plan. No one appears to be steering this colossal machine. Governments try to regulate the market, but technological innovation moves too fast for them to keep up. Huge corporations control whole industries, yet even they remain vulnerable to capitalism's internal dynamics. Ultimately, we are all passengers in a speeding vehicle hurtling toward uncertainty. But who is behind the wheel? The answer might be unsettling. Possibly no one. Capitalism, seen as a kind of emergent intelligence, might have transformed into a self-perpetuating system, growing independently without any central control. Philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari described capitalism as a flow of deterritorialization, an expanding force without borders or limits, consuming everything in its path. If this is true, stopping it may be impossible. Instead, the only option might be to compel it to disclose its ultimate fate. Acceleration could be the key to unlocking that revelation. If capitalism depends on endless growth to exist, what occurs when it accelerates beyond the capacity of its own foundations to hold? Technology may serve as its strongest ally, but it could also become its greatest adversary. If the pursuit of absolute efficiency leads to a world where humans are expendable, resources are drained to exhaustion, and inequality reaches intolerable levels, then acceleration may no longer be a choice, but an unavoidable journey toward collapse. The lingering question is, when that moment arrives, will we be prepared for what comes next? If capitalism is speeding toward its own demise, the critical issue is, will that end be a devastating collapse or a shift into something even more unpredictable? When a system falls apart, two outcomes are possible. Either it vanishes entirely, taking with it everything it once supported, or it undergoes a profound transformation into something new. But can we even imagine what lies beyond capitalism? Or are we so deeply immersed in it, like fish in water, that we can't even fathom its absence? This is where accelerationist thinking divides into two main perspectives. On one hand, there are those who believe capitalism is propelling us toward a post-capitalist world, where technology will liberate humanity from labor, inequality, and material constraints. This outlook resonates with Karl Marx's ideas, who argued that the advancement of productive forces would ultimately make capitalism obsolete. If technology can generate abundance, the system based on scarcity and competition would lose its foundation. We might enter a new phase where human labor is reduced to a minimum and society functions more cooperatively. However, there's another side, a much darker one. Accelerationism can also be interpreted as a prediction of humanity's end, as we currently know it. Nick Land and right-wing accelerationists reject the idea of a utopian, post-capitalist future. To them, capitalism and technology are inseparable, and their rapid advancement will bring us to a point where artificial intelligence and corporate dominance fully replace humans. They argue that the future does not belong to workers freed from oppression. It belongs to machines, autonomous beings that no longer require us. This depicts a reality in which capitalism persists, But humans are no longer central. A post-human era ruled by algorithmic systems that self-manage without consciousness or ethics. This vision aligns with what philosopher Gunther Anders described as the obsolescence of man. According to him, technological progress creates a gap between what we can produce and what we can comprehend and control. The outcome is an alienated humanity, unable to make sense of the world it has fashioned. Capitalism might be digging its own demise, but it could also be pulling humanity down alongside it. There's something deeply nihilistic in this perspective. In a world where technology can replace every human role, where market logic trumps all ethics and morality, what then becomes the purpose of human life? Are we moving toward a future where we become mere bystanders? Powerless observers watching a system rise that no longer requires us? Philosopher Franco Bifo Berardi argues that we find ourselves stuck in a mental deadlock. We understand capitalism as unsustainable, that its acceleration might lead to catastrophe, yet we cannot envision life beyond it. We exist in a state of paralysis where the only apparent choice is to keep pushing forward, even though the destination is unknown. This mindset mirrors that of an addict aware their addiction is ruining their life, but unable to quit because no alternatives are visible. But what if there is another way? What if acceleration is just a symptom of something deeper? A crisis not merely economic or technological, but existential. Ultimately, what do we really desire as a species? Do we want a world where technology liberates us, or one where it replaces us? Do we want capitalism to evolve, or for it to finally come to an end? Philosopher Slavoj Žižek proposes that rather than simply accepting acceleration as unavoidable, we must fundamentally rethink our own desires. If capitalism appears inevitable, it's because we remain ensnared in its mental frameworks. Yet history teaches us that no system is eternal. Feudalism once seemed everlasting until it ceased to be. Empires have fallen, civilizations have collapsed, entire worlds have vanished. Capitalism may be no different. The remaining question is, are we ready for what lies ahead? Or are we merely speeding toward a future we fail to comprehend? If capitalism is speeding headlong into the unknown, and if its principle of endless growth endangers both its survival and ours, then what choices remain for us? Should we just stand by and watch it fall apart? Or is there a way to steer it onto a different path? The initial response to this might be hopelessness. If we find ourselves in a vehicle without brakes, hurtling toward an uncertain fate, perhaps all we can do is prepare for the impact. Yet this perspective overlooks something crucial. History has never been a straight, predetermined line. Revolutions have taken place. The world has transformed. Capitalism did not just appear out of thin air. It arose from profound historical and cultural shifts that completely changed the rules. If it could emerge, it can also vanish. The challenge is that we have no clear picture of what a world without capitalism would look like. Perhaps this uncertainty is the system's greatest weapon, its power to convince us that it is the only possibility. But is it really true that no alternatives exist? Mark Fisher once noted that before we tear down any system, we must first imagine it as something that can end. As long as we believe capitalism is eternal, it persists, not because it's invincible, but because we believe in it. Jumbo Trilat took this even further, suggesting that capitalism might not require a traditional revolution to be destroyed. It could simply exhaust itself, collapsing under its own contradictions. If that's the case, then acceleration isn't merely a hazard, it's a chance. If capitalism can't be contained, maybe we can turn it against itself, drive it to a point where it reveals its vulnerabilities. The very technologies that today seem to empower it might become its downfall. Artificial intelligence, automation, digital decentralization. Ironically, these forces could undermine capitalism's foundations, lessening the need for human labor, diminishing the value of private property, and challenging the core logic of the market. However, none of this will unfold on its own, not without thoughtful reflection and deliberate action. The downfall of capitalism might usher in something even more troubling. The issue isn't solely economic, it's deeply psychological. Gilles Deleuze explained that capitalism is more than just a system. It's a mode of subjectivation, shaping how we think, feel, and desire. It doesn't simply govern our lives, it shapes our very identities. If we desire a different future, the first step is to liberate our own minds. We must learn to look beyond the frameworks imposed by the market. This requires questioning the assumption that infinite growth equals progress. It means challenging the belief that efficiency and productivity are the sole measures of value. Above all, it demands accepting that the future can be fundamentally different from the present, and that this difference could actually be beneficial. Nietzsche cautioned that those who battle monsters must be careful not to become monsters themselves. If we resist capitalism by mimicking its logic, focusing only on hastening its collapse without contemplating what follows, we risk sinking into the very existential emptiness that capitalism enforces upon us. True revolution is found not merely in destruction, but in the creation of something new. What does this look like in practice? Before any global transformation can take place, we must change how we think and how we live. Small acts can produce significant effects, slowing down, reconsidering our consumption, valuing cooperation over competition, and fostering lifestyles that are not dictated by profit motives. This doesn't mean rejecting technology or progress, but rather reclaiming them for purposes beyond the marketplace. Ultimately, perhaps the most vital question isn't about capitalism itself, but about what we want to follow it. The future isn't set in stone, it's being shaped right now. By us, by the choices we make, and by our ability to envision something beyond what has been forced upon us. And the only certainty we hold is this: either we discover an alternative, or capitalism will ensure an ending for all of us. If capitalism is a machine racing toward the unknown, then the real question isn't just when it will end, but what remains once it disappears. Will we be passive witnesses to an unavoidable downfall, caught within a system that speeds ever faster toward an uncertain fate? Or will we summon the bravery to imagine something new before it's too late? History has already proven that no empire endures forever. Feudalism once seemed everlasting until it vanished. The Roman Empire believed itself invincible, yet it collapsed beneath the weight of its own growth. Capitalism itself emerged from the ruins of past systems, and now perhaps it too is nearing its breaking point. As Walter Benjamin observed, the progress once seen as our guardian angel may instead become the angel of destruction. If the system falls, it may drag down not only its inequalities and contradictions, but the very foundations of society as we understand it. The technology that once promised liberation and plenty could turn into the instrument of our own obsolescence. And ultimately, perhaps the gravest danger isn't capitalism's end, but the chance it persists without us. A system that no longer requires humans, only machines, algorithms, and markets that govern themselves, without any ethical concern. But this is not the only outcome. The end of capitalism need not be an apocalypse. It could be a passage to something better, something we have yet to fully envision. The true challenge, then, is not just to hasten the collapse, but to imagine what follows after it. If we fail to envision an alternative, when the system falls, we will fall along with it. The philosopher Antonio Gramsci once observed that we live in a time of crisis, where the old world is fading away, but the new one has yet to emerge. Perhaps we are exactly in that moment, a phase of uncertainty where the future is being shaped right now through our choices, our actions, and our capacity to think beyond what we've been taught. So the ultimate question isn't merely whether capitalism will end, but who we will become when it does. If we want to navigate this transition successfully, we must begin constructing a new world before the old one completely falls apart. If you've stayed with me this far, it's because these ideas resonated with you somehow. And that's the heart of philosophy: to question, to think deeper, to look beneath the surface. What we are experiencing now is not just an economic or technological collapse, but an existential crisis. The question, will capitalism soon come to an end, is fundamentally a question about ourselves. What kind of future do we desire? And honestly, I'd love to hear your perspective. Do you believe capitalism will vanish, or will it just morph into something even more chaotic? Let me know in the comments below. And if this video made you reflect, please share it with someone else who needs to consider these ideas. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. The capitalist algorithm might be trying to control us, but at least for now, we still hold some power over it. Now the decision is yours. Will you accelerate forward or seek out a different path? Before you leave, there are two videos on your screen right now. One dives into another concept that seems impossible to surpass, but might actually be nearing its limit. The other discusses a philosophical question that could completely transform how you view the world. Choose one and continue this journey. See you in the next video.